The last time that we saw this map, we explored why the most likely post-war outcome for these semi-autonomous regions in Russia is to become, well, more semi-autonomous. That, of course, does not eliminate the chances that a civil war could break out in the country in a few years. So, in today's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline, we discuss how to think about civil wars more generally, with Russia as our motivating case. We discuss a lot about how wars start across countries, but we rarely talk about how wars start within countries. Does the crisis bargaining model still work when we apply it to how civil wars erupt, or do we need a different theoretical framework to explain it? I would assume that for the crisis bargaining model, all you have to do is substitute the other country for a rebel group, and everything would hold. If so, would that mean that when bargaining does fail and war starts, it usually takes a different form than wars between states? Generally speaking, the answer is yes. It is the same puzzle as interstate wars. Fighting is costly, so in principle, deals should exist that leave both parties better off. You will note that I purposefully constructed that sentence to avoid referencing any states, so it applies just as well to intrastate war as it does to interstate war. That said, the types of bargaining frictions that lead to civil war can differ than what happens on the international stage. So let me walk through 5 of the most important incentives, using a potential civil war in Russia as a framing device. 1. War exhaustion. 2. Coordination and protests. 3. The credibility of post-war settlements. 4. Bargaining with multiple breakaway regions. And 5. Militant groups attacking to woo donors. The most pressing issue for Russia post-Ukraine war will likely be a short-term hollowing out of the state apparatus, so we will start there. We all know that the government is facing a budget problem now. Ending the war will provide direct relief in the form of all of those war expenses coming off the books, but it will also lead to a period of economic turmoil, as the central bank will face a cooling economy that could spiral into a deep recession. There may therefore be a period of unease, where both political and economic forces pressure the military to take it easy everywhere else for a bit, including internal conflicts. I think we can all appreciate the irony here. Russia exerts so much effort to militarize, only for it to be left militarily vulnerable. But that is what happens when all of your equipment gets destroyed in Ukraine, and you have spent the last 3 years training non-ethnic Russians to be masters of modern warfare. Of course, this type of war exhaustion will not last forever, creating a window of opportunity for rebel groups before power shifts back to normal in Russia. Of the mechanisms that I will cover today, this is the least Civil War-centric. You will recognize it as a classic preventive war incentive. The one civil distinction to make here is that usually when your country has exhausted itself with an interstate war, it is not a major problem because you should have also simultaneously exhausted your main international rival, whereas your civil challengers are always waiting in the wings. Then again, this is the same concern that followed in the wake of the Iran war, with the short supply of Tomahawk missiles in US inventories creating concerns about what China might do with Taiwan. So, what do I know? Another recurring theme on this channel is how protest movements are fleeting. This is because successful marches on the street require coordination among the masses to all show up at the same time, and there is no guarantee that everyone will resurface, say, next month, if everyone goes home today. Like before, this creates a familiar shifting power preventive war incentive. The government would like to offer concessions to appease the protesters, but it is far too easy for the government to pull back on the concessions that they have offered. This is a bit of a double whammy as compared to interstate conflict, where proposal power is not so obviously tilted in the direction that favors war. In any case, the protesters recognize the government's inability to credibly commit to a deal, and choose to fight while they represent a cohesive threat. And if I may expand on this question slightly, the biggest difference between interstate and intrastate conflict is that civil wars are far, far more difficult to resolve with a negotiated settlement. I still find it humorous how much conversation there is regarding the enforceability of a treaty between Russia and Ukraine,
as well as a separate treaty between the United States and Iran. Those types of deals are comparatively easy to enforce in the long run, because after those wars end, both sides will retreat back with their armies still intact, which means that everyone can still restart a war if they feel like it. To make sure that no one wants to restart the war, we simply need to have an agreement that falls within the respective pairs' bargaining range. By definition, any such deal is mutually better than reverting to war, and in turn, such deals are self-enforcing. Perhaps you picked up on the problem here. In contrast to interstate conflict, when civil wars end, rarely do both parties retreat back with their armies intact. Maybe if this is a breakaway region. But such an outcome is basically impossible in center-seeking civil wars, when you have one side that wants to take over the government's capital. For those civil wars to end, you usually need to have the parties fold back up into a single government once again, but that implies that the losing party's army must put down its arms. But you can see where there is an enforceability problem here. If I agree to a deal and then lay my arms down, I no longer can revert to war to enforce the terms of the settlement. Realizing that, I will be very hesitant to agree to any deal whatsoever. We have already seen the failure of appreciating these incentives in the last few years. Think back to Yevgeny Prigozhin's mutiny. The Wagner leader tried to stage a coup against the Kremlin, but failing to heed Mike Ehrmantraut's warnings about half measures, he indeed stopped halfway on his march to Moscow. Ostensibly, Belarus had set up a deal where Prigozhin could give up his mutiny, continue to have some sort of mercenary army, and move his operations to Belarus. Unfortunately for him, it does not seem that Lukashenko had any ability to assist with the enforcement of that deal, which resulted in Prigozhin's plane having a special landing operation. This credible commitment problem is apparent in the data on war termination, where the majority of interstate wars end in a negotiated settlement, but the vast majority of intrastate wars end with the military defeat of one party. In the rare cases where there is some sort of negotiated settlement, it requires a third-party enforcer to oversee the settlement and provide a credible commitment to the losing party to intervene and protect the losing party should the winning party try to exploit the losing party having laid down its arms. I suppose that the punchline for Russia here is that if a civil war erupts after the end of the Russia-Ukraine war, the civil war is likely to last a long time until either the Russian government gives up on trying to suppress the rebellion, or all of the rebels are essentially dead. Goodness knows that no one is going to be interested in trying to threaten to intervene against Moscow, should the Kremlin decide to rip up a deal. Moving past the issues with credible commitment, the fourth topic to discuss is the incentive for the government to project resolve when it faces multiple potential rebellions. This is not a direct source of bargaining failure, but rather, it tells us what might happen given that there is a bargaining friction. Specifically, the bargaining friction of importance here is uncertainty about the government's ability and willingness to suppress civil wars when they arise. If we work through the first-order incentives, imagine that a primary separatist group approaches the government and demands either greater autonomy or outright independence. It may very well be the case that the government would prefer giving those concessions due to its weakened military capacity, if this were a single interaction. However, if there is a second rebel group waiting in the wings, then the government must be concerned that granting autonomy to the first group signals to the second group the government's inability to suppress a rebellion. And thus, the first concession leads to a second concession, which may lead to a third concession, and a fourth concession, and so forth. I also think that this map helps us see a starker difference between the incentive in intrastate conflict versus interstate conflict. What I have described is pretty much identical to the domino theory that was prevalent during the Cold War, and it was one of the main reasons that the United States was so interested in fighting in Vietnam. The scope of the problem looks much worse when failure to heed that warning results in the complete dissection of your country, though. Now, you may have noticed that I stressed that what I just described were the first-order incentives associated with trying to build a reputation. Whether this actually results in more wars occurring is a more complicated story, because there is a countervailing second-order incentive. Potential rebel groups know that the government may respond with a clenched fist to their demands for concessions, precisely because the government wants to establish a reputation for resolve. Consequently, a strategic rebel group might lower their demands to something that the government is willing to concede, because it is commensurate with what a strong government would be willing to give up. And at that point, there is no need for the government to signal resolve. A resolved government would accept these minimal demands from the rebel group. What I described is actually the most complicated model featured in formal models of crisis bargaining. One of the things that book shows is that the second-order incentive might dominate the first. In turn, it is ambiguous whether the Russian government situation will lead to more or less conflict after the troops come home from Ukraine. The final important distinction between civil conflict and interstate conflict is the incentive for insurgent groups to try to establish themselves in the marketplace of militants. The central premise of crisis bargaining theory is that war is costly, and so the parties should negotiate a resolution instead. This concern turns that premise on its head, suggesting that committing violence allows a rebel group to secure funds from ideologically inclined donors. Thus, there is profit to be had from the conflict that normally does not appear when we have two countries trying to fight each other. Usually, this incentive is the strongest when there are multiple groups competing over the same set of donors. So it is tempting to look back at that map and think that there will be a lot of competition here. However, each of these regions is a separate ethnic group with separate desires for independence. Sure, there may be a set of donors that are generally anti-Russia. For example, you could think about Ukrainian secret intelligence willing to fund any or all of them. But mostly, each group will be fighting internally among funders from that ethnic group. If I were the Kremlin, I would be very worried about this incentive to commit violence for fundraising purposes. Moreover, I do not think that this is just a problem associated with the post-war world. And it is a bit of a puzzle that we haven't seen more of this violence happening already, given that the market of donors currently exists, and militant groups would like to tap into those resources now, just as much as they would like to post-Ukraine. Perhaps the spark that will light this is all of those experienced soldiers coming home, and some of them looking for a new place to apply their craft. So, what are our takeaway points for today? Just like interstate war, intrastate war is a bargaining problem. Much of that logic from interstate crisis bargaining therefore applies to intrastate crisis bargaining. However, there are features of civil war that are unique to that subset of conflicts, and thus the concerns that we have in one field are not an exact duplicate of our concerns in the other field. These incentive structures are layered, and we need to think past the first-order incentives if we want to understand how the concerns map to whether wars actually occur. Meanwhile, if you like maps, and especially lines being drawn on them, might I refer you to the archive of the Geopolitics Helpline? Click there to go through all of the older videos. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow. Take care.